My great-grandparents, Willa Mae and Eva Tucker, were sharecroppers at the Jeb Cox Plantation in Tunica County, Mississippi. In 1946, they ran away in the middle of the night with my 2-year-old grandmother and her 4 older siblings to escape Southern racial terror and violence for the idea of hope and dignity. Their story is one of 6 million Black Americans who left the South between 1916 and 1970 to cities of the North. Most, if not all, of my family history has been told to me orally. There is no centralized history book taught in a classroom that discusses what happened to my family. How many of us can say we read our history in the classroom? When I was a child, I would love going to history museums, the tall ceilings, the way my voice echoed. But as a child, I always felt embarrassed to see how small the sections of my history was in the museums, and how monuments of my people were only of the same 2 to 3 people. I have always felt that memorials did not fully encompass all of my history or tell me the entire truth. Globally, there's been a broad interest to push for memorial museums to shift how the present interacts with society's past and come to terms by addressing it through memorialization. Memorials have been formed to more adequately address the new form of remembrance. I'm sure we can all think of a memorial or monument that has taught us something that made us proud about US history. And then there are some we can think of that have taught us about the horrors of this country. They are supposed to teach us the lessons of the past, discuss conflicts, violence, and genocides, and positive events to ensure the society will not forget. According to the National Registrar for Historical Places, of the 100,000 places of significance to the US, only 2% of them reflect the enormous contribution of Black Americans. Not including the Namak, it amounts to about 2,000 sites in the US. How many of these locations do you think you can name? How many have you visited? Have you heard about the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Martin Luther King House, the Juneteenth Monument, the Tuskegee Airmen Monument? What about the Slave Market plaque in New York City, or the Tulsa Massacre Memorial? What about the Little Rock 9 statue? To be honest, I can probably name about 10 to 15, and I'm sure you're probably just as embarrassed as I am. But why don't we know? From a peace builder perspective, memorials are seen as a sign of movement towards transitional justice, reconciliation, and small steps towards peace. So why are these things not available to us? What does that say? In 2017, I traveled to Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and went to the Chong Uk Genocide Center. Between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge took power of the Cambodian Civil War after the Civil War. The Cambodian genocide resulted in 1.5 to 3 million people killed at the hands of the Khmer Rouge. According to the Documentation Center of Cambodia, there are more than 20,000 mass grave sites across Cambodia. In 1988, the Cheong Uk was unveiled to commemorate the millions of people executed during the Khmer Rouge regime. When I went to visit, you could feel the eeriness and uneasiness of being there. And the dome-shaped Buddhist monument over the site is filled with over 5,000 human skulls. Around the center, there is a glass box, and in it contains clothing items of the victims. It was said that they have not found all of the mass graves throughout Cambodia. I was also told that every time it rains, more skulls and body parts and clothing erode from the soil. It was so easy for me to be engulfed in the desire to learn more about this history and how it impacts their Cambodians' everyday life. But then it hit me. Where was this energy for my own people? As a Black woman in the international development peace-building field, I tether the line quite often. I must reconcile how I can work in these countries to push for peace and reconciliation when these things are not happening in my own country. The roles of memorials in social reconstruction and transitional justice have been broken up into 3 categories. 1, memorials to genocide and mass killings, Cambodia, Rwanda, the Holocaust. 2, memorials of disappearance, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, Chile, the South Korean comfort women. 3, memorials to ethnic conflict, Rwanda, the Balkans, apartheid, Northern Ireland. The uncomfortable truth is that it's easy for us to categorize other countries and to tell them how to solve their conflict when we have yet to do it here in America ourselves. Can we truly have memorials and museums without fully acknowledging from the government or having any level of accountability or any structural change? Nowadays, you cannot scroll on your social media platforms and not see hashtag insert Black person's name, justice for insert Black person's name. Black person was doing regular people things when they were unlawfully arrested or accused of doing something. Or a video of police brutality, hate crime, or someone getting off or committing a violent crime against us. This ongoing violence is not new. We just now have phones. In the US, structural violence can be traced back to 400 years ago, when the first enslaved person was here in 1619, before the US Constitution was created. When it was, we were considered 3/4 of a human, which gave justification for structural and direct violence. Generally, many Americans believe slavery ended after the Emancipation Proclamation in September 22nd, 1862, but it actually didn't end until June 16th, 1865, which we now recognize as Juneteenth. What didn't end was a system that perpetuates racial inequality against African Americans. When slavery ended, other forms of discrimination began. Black codes, segregation, Jim Crow, redlining, school to prison pipeline, continued police brutality, housing discrimination, discriminatory legislative, educational gaps, economic disparities, and the violence continued throughout the generations. The Rosewood Massacre, the Tulsa Massacre, Jim Crow, the Red Summer, the killing of Emmett Till, continued police brutality, Charlottesville, Charleston Church Massacre, and so many other examples that would take me all day to explain 400 years of history and how it impacts us every day. The Equal Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization confronting racial justice and the masterminds behind the National Memorial for Peace and Justice Museum, says, in the US, history markers are used to distract us from our true history. Historical markers such as memorials of peace and commemorating prominent civil rights monuments do not leave a lot of room for discussion or education about atrocities committed. The NMOC, right here in DC, takes you on a journey from 1619 to current time to talk about the traumas, the joy, and the resilience of Black Americans. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice, a memorial dedicated to the legacy of enslaved Black people, people terrorized by lynching, African Americans humiliated by racial segregation and Jim Crow, seeks to publicly confront the truth about American history that is often silenced, to move towards recovery and reconciliation. For example, the pillars built to represent 4,000 people recorded being lynched in Montgomery, Alabama during Jim Crow will be acknowledged by moving the pillars to each location of their lynching. This form of truth-telling of African Americans puts responsibility on states such as Alabama and the families of perpetrators to take responsibility for the actions taken in the violence against us during Jim Crow. The creation of memorials such as the National Peace and Justice and the NMOC are great first steps to educating through offering resources and telling the entire truth. But the passive behavior of the US government supporting similar memorials abroad without publicly apologizing or recognizing the role in the violence is hypocritical. So what do I suggest we do? First, before anything, the government needs to first acknowledge it and apologize. We need to secondly, do less talking, more action. Black history needs to be expounded on in our history books. When children are in school, they should be well-versed in more than World War I and more than when Blacks were enslaved, but should be able to know the history of my people, other minorities, and the violence America has committed against us. 3, ongoing learning. There are resources in the places at memorials and museums, but we cannot continue to use them as crutches, or only when we visit, that's it, and we go back to our day. We need to seek to understand and implement those things that we've learned at these memorials and museums into our day-to-day life. And fourth, which cannot happen without the first one, we need reconciliation, truth-telling, and reparations at a national level. But unfortunately, these things cannot happen because the violence against Black Americans still continues to this day. Memorials and monuments are not a bad thing. They represent what has happened in the past and how it currently impacts our society. It acknowledges the people that have positively impacted our country. But America continues to use them as crutches instead of taking the accountability and doing the real work. As an international development and peace-building practitioners, we need to do better. When we expect other countries to do the work in transitional justice and reconciliation, we need to begin to point inward. Are you doing the work at home? There's no perfect memorial or museum. There is no blueprint that perfectly captures and acknowledges the generations of trauma that still go on after, even though there's reconciliation. But many of them are further than we are. My great-grandparents, Willa Mae and Eva Tucker, ran to the North from racial terror that unfortunately still exists today, but through other structural institutions. Their history deserves to be acknowledged, seen, and taught in our classrooms, and apologized for. One day, their names won't just be on memorials, plaques, or museums, but their story will be known globally and recognized and understood that terrors that they experienced cannot happen again. Thank you.